Good evening and welcome everybody to this In Dialogue with the artists Jennifer Allora and Guillermo Calzadilla, as well as fellow religiously scholar Dr. Jonathan Zecher. We are delighted to welcome you to this program today, whether you're in Houston, Puerto Rico, and Australia, like our co-panelists, or around the world. Our program is organized in conjunction with the Menil Collection's exhibition, Allora Calzadilla, Specters of Noon, which is on view until June 20th, 2021. So there still might be time to sneak in with your mask and be safe in this encounter. For their exhibition, the artistic duo Allora Calzadilla is conceived of 7 works that together evoke the spirit of Acedia, a condition described in early Christian texts as a demon that besieges the soul at the height of midday, what we would call noon. Our conversation this evening will consider how the works in the exhibition together revolve around this concept of Acedia, serving as a manifestation for noon's hold over humankind and as a metaphor for the uncertainties that we are experiencing right now. I am Niki Clements. I'm a professor of religion at Rice University, the Watt J. Lilly Jackson Assistant Professor of Religion, as well as the Allison Seraphin Distinguished Professor in the Humanities. I'm delighted to be here as an ethicist, as a scholar of John Cashin, as well as Michel Foucault. And today I'm enjoying the company of these wonderful people who are channeling in. First, I'm delighted to welcome the artists, Jennifer Allora and Guillermo Calzadilla, who are joining us from Puerto Rico.
Hello.
Okay.
Hi, Niki.
Welcome. So since 1995, Jennifer and Guillermo have built a research-based practice that engages both the history of art and responds critically to the intersections between culture, history, and geopolitics. Their work is fascinating, and the ways in which they deal not only with the archives and the particulars of the Menil Collection and the surrealist art and thought and machinations, but also with the ways in which the sacred and the Byzantine and the iconic resonate throughout their work, makes their work both profoundly one of the Menil, as well as one that challenges us in our own time. The duo produces interdisciplinary works combining performance, sculpture, sound, video, and photography. And their work has been exhibited extensively internationally, participating in many biennales, including the 56th and 51st Venice Biennale. So welcome all. I'm also delighted to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Jonathan Zecher, who's joining us from Melbourne. Good morning.
Good evening.
Jonathan is currently a senior research fellow at Australian Catholic University's Institute for Religion and Critical Inquiry, where he studies early Christian asceticism, the medical cultures of late antiquity, and traditions of prayer and spiritual practice in Byzantium and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. He received his PhD from Durham University in 2012 in patristics and historical theology, and from 2011 to 2017, he was a visiting assistant professor at the University of Houston. This means that Jonathan is not only deeply familiar with and in awe of the Menil Collection, but also has deep personal and ancestral roots in our hometown. So before I get started with our own program, I'd like to invite all the participants who are chiming in to email programs@menil.org. And we're really aiming for a conversation tonight. This is not going to be a typical academic panel where we talk and we pontificate and tell you what to do. Instead, we are trying to engage each other in a more lively discussion on this question of Acedia, this question of the noonday demon that resonates so deeply with us all. So please submit your questions at programs@menil.org, and we will take them as part of the conversation. So feel like this is a dynamic space where you too can be chiming in. I would also like to start by recognizing the amazing senior curator, Michelle White, who has been working in collaboration with the artists, Jennifer and Guillermo, for the last 4 years, at least, in order to make this particular exhibition on the Specters of Noon happen. And through some fascinating encounters, I became a part of this project because the noonday demon is a dear and central friend and foe of John Cassian, of whom I'm a scholar. He's a 4th, 5th century Christian ascetic and monastic who has deeply shaped the spiritual life of Benedictine monasticism. So before we move to the artists, I want to start with a sense of place and time. And my own experience of engaging in the exhibit is one that might be a little illustrative because we don't all have the opportunity to come in and experience it right now. And there's something to the physiology of the experience that's really important. Right? I noted how the artists are really dealing with so many different sensory experiences, and this really registers within Specters of Noon. So as you walk into the space, it's not just that your eyes and the visual senses engage, but instead you have a very visceral sense through the humming in B flat of the central work, Blackout. You have a disorienting sense of having these sounds, both chirping and voices coming in at random moments. And so to walk into the exhibition of Specters of Noon is to experience that displacement and disorientation that unsettles you from your typical thoughts, feelings, and actions. And I think that anybody chiming in right now is going to be feeling that sense of a need for disorientation, a need to name the problems, a need to have connection despite and in and through these crises. And this is one of the many things that I think this exhibition just not only puts on display for us to see, but it evokes in terms of how we feel. It's an exhibition of great delight and whimsy as well. So it's not just about this noonday demon, who in Cassian's world is the demon of sloth as he becomes moralized through Gregory the Great and the 7 deadly sins. Instead, Acedia is the demon of spiritual torpor and feeling overburdened and feeling like you have so much work. How can you possibly do anything at all? If we don't feel like that resonates right now, then I'm a very bad academic and you all are saints. But that sense, at least, that some of us can fess up to, of feeling that sense of being so overwhelmed that you can't do anything. Feeling like you can't possibly go one more step forward in the quotidian, everyday habits that have anesthetized you to the experience of something new. So tonight we will be experiencing something new. We will be starting with the exhibition after we ask the artists just for a little opening, an opening sense of what brought you to the Specters of Noon in particular, this demon of Acedia that ties all 4 of us here at this moment.
Thank you. So I'm going to now speak to the, as Niki suggested, the kind of how we got to this theme and really how the exhibition itself came together really conceptually. And that's the part in which I'm going to really speak about. So I have since written because it makes it easier for me to sort of bring my thoughts together. So please forgive that. But in this exhibition, we're exploring this archetypal significance of noon and its poetic representation. In particular, we were thinking about noonscape as a subjective projection of a particular human mood. And that mood, as Niki described, is this acedia or acedia. We learned about this term, acedia, from a short text written in 1939 by in the Surrealist journal Minotaur that was written by Roger Calwa, and it was under the title The Noon Complex. In this text, he writes, "It's not difficult to uncover the cause of noon's prestige. This is the moment when the sun, at its zenith, divides the day into equal parts, each governed by the opposing signs of rise and decline. It is the moment when the forces of life and light yield to the powers of death and darkness, the time when shade is at a low point, and thus when the exposed soul is most vulnerable to all kinds of dangers. For similar reasons, noon is generally the hour when the dead or those who cast no shadow make their appearance. Calwell then goes on to describe the physiological effects of noon, and especially in the fiery countries of the South, which of course we felt much kinship with being from Puerto Rico, and also thinking about an exhibition that would take place in Houston, as it was originally planned in the summer months, where the sun's unrelentless blaze causes everything from heat stroke to cerebral fever. This, he argues, offered sufficient proof of demonic activity to persuade people that they actually existed. And unlike midnight, the nocturnal counterpart of midday, it was only this intolerable light of noon that had the ability to dispatch these demons, which I find really interesting, whereas midnight only welcomes them. So it's this kind of really intensity of this noon moment, this physiological striking moment where these demons are unleashed. Perhaps most famous of these demons is this demonium meridianum that we're talking about in early Christian monastic thought. And Calwell describes the circumstances of the demon's arrival with great clarity. And again, I quote, "At noon, it would seem that life takes a pause. Organic matter returns to an inorganic state, and everything blazes pointlessly and without ardor in the futile desire for luxury and display. Activity of any kind seems to involve unpleasant and risible agitation. All heartbeats come to a halt. The supreme triumph of positive forces dissolve into renunciation, their surging forth into slumber and their plenitude into resignation." Quite understandably, Calwell argues, for the desert monks, the seduction of such a scene, which leads to them wanting to throw in their hands and say, "What's the use?" is none other than the noonday demon. And it's the sinful sadness or acedia that afflicts the monks in the middle of the day, and with effects so serious that, he reminds us, it was unhesitatingly classified as one of the deadly sins. This spiritual crisis, triggered by an encounter with midday, is in many ways the subject of our exhibition, both at the individual level and also as a larger societal phenomenon. We wondered, if we think about our present epoch under the conditions of high noon, what insights would such an imaginative exercise reveal to us? And taking cue from Calwell's essay, our exhibition presents this besieged vision of the present.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So, Cesar, if we can move to the exhibition video, we will be able to get an experiential sense of what the Specters of Noon looks like. And I'll be reading from John Cashin's Institute's book 10 on Acedia. Our sixth struggle is what the Greeks call Acedia, which we can refer to as a wearied or anxious heart. It is akin to sadness and is the peculiar lot of solitaries, and a particularly dangerous and frequent foe of those dwelling in the desert. It disturbs the monk, especially around the 6th hour, noon, rushing in upon him like a kind of fever at just this time, and inflicting upon the enfeebled soul the most burning heat of its attacks at regular and set intervals. Some of the elders declared that this is the noonday demon that is mentioned in the 90th Psalm. Once this demon has seized possession of a wretched mind, it makes a person horrified at where he is, disgusted with his cell, and also disdainful and contemptuous of the brothers who live with him or at a slight distance, as being careless and unspiritual. Likewise, it renders him slothful and immobile in the face of all the work to be done within the walls of the dwelling. It does not allow him to stay still in his cell or to devote any effort to reading. He groans quite frequently that spending such a long time there is of no profit, and he will possess no spiritual fruit for as long as he is attached to that group of people. He complains and sighs, lamenting that he is bereft and void of all gain. And what does he want to do but fall asleep for just a quick nap, go get a snack, or reach out to community members that you sure will learn very much through his edifying discourse. So this is a beautiful introduction to both the exhibition as well as the ethos behind it. I also want to thank Zecher Carrera, who is doing the tech behind the scenes, as well as Tony Martinez and our wonderful program director, Lauren Pollock. I'd like to turn things over right now to Jonathan Zecher, who will bring us into the worldview of late antiquity and the ways in which Acedia is not something that is pathologized as modern depressive disorder, but instead is a central and live and vibrant agent amongst many.
All right, thank you very much, Niki. Free and independent may be the slogan of American expansion, and a fundamental assumption about the modern self, that we are somehow these autonomous, bounded, stable beings. But this isn't the worldview of ancient people or of early Christian monastics. And as Niki said, I want to set that up for you just a bit now and offer some connections both to what you've already heard from Cassian and from Jennifer, and also some connections to our own time and Specters of Noon. So to begin with, early monks didn't see themselves as independent. They were bound to family, community, city, monastery, church, always part of something larger than themselves and always attached in ways that could be problematic. They didn't see themselves as free either. They were responsible for their actions, certainly, but they were suspended in a web of other agents and forces. Some are malevolent, like demons. Some are benevolent, like angels. Some are more complicated, like one's brothers or sisters in the monastery. These other agents act on minds, on emotions, and even on bodies. They can inspire thoughts and dreams, emotions, actions. They can tempt or they can assist. In this world, the self, too, is multiple, not just body and soul, but mind, heart, desire, memory, other faculties. As a multiplicity, the self is in constant danger of fragmentation, of being pulled toward this or that desire, of being roused by a memory to actions or emotions that they did not choose. Stability is something earned through practice. Now, the world of early monks constituted a layered and entangled ecology of agents and selves. Within this, they pursued unity with God through prayer and stability in themselves through ascetic practices. That pursuit was endangered by numerous temptations, and now we come to Acedia. Evagrius of Pontus, a monk in the 4th century, organized all the temptations into 8 generic trains of thought, which his disciple John Cassian and numerous other authors would say define the range of ways in which a human being can misfunction. These are greed, gluttony, lust, anger, sadness, acedia, vainglory, and pride. A modified version comes to us as the 7 deadly sins. But for Evagrius and Cassian, as you've already heard from Niki, these thoughts, especially acedia, are more complicated than just sins. Now, acedia itself, and you may also have heard it pronounced or pronounce it acedia or acedia, they're all good. Acedia is marked by the paradoxical constellation of tedium and anxiety, of boredom, restless energy, and overwhelming inertia. And so in one sense, it's a passion, that is a strong emotion resulting from attachments and frustrations for which they would have said the monk is responsible. But it's also a demon, the noonday demon, an external force acting on the self for which they would say the monk is not responsible. It is a condition imposed, but it is also a mark of progress. It's an experience that is associated with the more solitary life, the advanced forms of monasticism, and the frontiers of what they would call pure prayer. And to recognize this experience is to make progress. Now, this ancient worldview and its experience in passions like Acedia probably seems foreign, but I don't think it's all that far from us. For example, for many of us, the conditions of the pandemic have recreated those of early hermits: physical isolation, interruptions to schedules, lack of sociality, and generate constellations of feelings that sound eerily like acedia. But the other side of it is important too. Oh, maybe it's not demons, but we are haunted by other forces. These too are made visible by the pandemic, or more recently by extreme weather events. It's not just the virus, but the need to wear masks and stay home, mandated or not by government policies, or pushes to reopen driven by economic fears. It's not just the cold or the snow, but the power failure and the price spikes that are driven by a deregulated power grid and the greed, indeed the drive to be free and independent, that created it. Such forces normally impose themselves invisibly. We don't notice them at work. But right now, thanks to the pandemic, thanks to the weather, it's noon, a moment of Acedia, but also a moment of illumination, in which everything can be seen, including the web of agents and structures that have brought this moment into being, and which have been so powerfully displayed and dissected for us in Specters of Noon.
Beautiful, Jonathan. So this is such a wonderful way of presenting the two faces to Acedia, where on the one hand, we have that individual experience of malaise, of ennui, of listlessness and boredom and enervation. And on the other hand, we have this sense that we are all bound up in these ecologies of various agencies, of various structural forms that encode hierarchies of domination. And as we were hearing just now, in terms of the past month of February in Texas, in Houston in particular, and both the extreme weather event as well as the failure of the power grid to protect and maintain the conditions for living for millions of people. This, of course, is something that resonates with the experience during Maria that has in some ways contributed to Specters of Noon. And on a human level, maybe we can start out by thinking about what these conditions allow us to see about the crisis, because experiencing it in such a raw form in Houston right now, I think we're still recalibrating, and yet we've seen this before and it will happen again. And so if maybe the artist Jennifer and Guillermo can start off by thinking through the connection between Specters of Noon and this Acedia, as well as the environmental and ecological conditions and climate crisis that have also been its generator.
Yeah.
Wow.
Certainly, this exhibition definitely is a culmination of our experience, as you mentioned, living in the Caribbean and the kind of constant state of emergency that it has, it feels like it has been in, at least for, well, I mean, we could even say from the beginning of the colonial period, and which you know, marker do we want to start off as the moment when this larger crisis, which we can call colonialism, really took hold. But certainly in the last 20 years, I'd say there's been a kind of building up of a multiple set of cascading of crisis events on top of crisis events on top of crisis events that bring together these very clearly or make visible, like Noon does, right? Noon is this thing that makes visible these kind of breaking downs of these systems. So there are these ways that there's been a systemic breakdown of basic functions of governance, of, you know, of the way that trade works, of the way that infrastructure works. And, you know, Puerto Rico has been going through a fiscal crisis, a governmental crisis, an ecological crisis. And it's been an ongoing, you know, experience that, that we're living through. So again, these themes seem very close to our personal lived experience being here in the Caribbean.
Also, something interesting about the word Acedia, that's how I say it, is that it came out of use in the 1930s, and it was actually out of the dictionary. And then in the mid-20th century, after the horrors of the wars, it came back to use again. So there is something about the word and the need to describe a condition that it's that the genealogy of the word itself, you know, and how it appear and disappear makes visible. That is interesting to mention.
That's beautiful. And the Greek etymology in itself, the akedos, it's the kedos is care and the a is the privative. So it's the lack of care. Mm-hmm. And it's, as Jonathan was saying, really important that it's when you're already making progress. And it seems like to tie some of these things together, works of yours like Manifest and Blackout and Cadastre, these are testaments to the legacies of colonialism and the ravages of imperialism and the ways within which the conditions that have been so long set up are continuing to reverberate differentially in the lives of people. And that's what we've seen so keenly over the last month in Houston, certainly. But it's that sense that technology both produces and transforms and creates, but can also be the condition for our own undoing in and through that sense of being paralyzed.
Yeah, paralyzed. It's interesting because it's not paralyzed. Acedia, it's careless not in the sense of being carefree, free and easy, but of caring too much, and so being overwhelmed. It's like the whole system is the whole emotional system is overwhelmed by it, and so like the transformer, which explodes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that it wasn't doing anything; it's that it was doing so much that it couldn't take it anymore. And we've put so much weight on these systems, which are meant to ease lives and sort of make greater conveniences, that in the end, when they are overwhelmed, we find out how much care we'd actually put in when they can't work anymore.
I'd like to say that reminds me of I would like to add that the work of Blackout is against power transformer that was part of an electrical explosion that happened in Puerto Rico in 2016. So it was not, one of the more recent ones, but these things are kind of happening quite often because of the aging electrical grid here on the island and the lack of care towards its maintenance that has happened because of this fiscal austerity that the island faces, and complicated bond issuings and other nefarious monetary factors that make these things dysfunctional. But the work, is basically this object, but the object is the locus of a performance, of an event that will take place, hopefully by the end of the exhibition here in Houston in June, if the health conditions permit. But what I wanted to describe was the performance uses a text that it comes from Benjamin Franklin. So we work with composer David Lang on the developing the score of the work. And hold on a second. Maybe Guillermo, explain what the work's about.
Yeah. Tony, can you put the image of Blackout? We have, that's
where is it? Where is it?
Yeah, the next one. Yeah, that's great. You can go to the one before. Perfect. Thank you. So, yeah, it's a power transformer, and in the methodology of making the work and thinking about noon and midday, we use a sculptural proceeding of cutting or splitting. This is something in particular work you could see. So we cut the work in half, exposing the interior of it. So you see this midday process of splitting, and also in the tension between the work not being dead or not being fully alive, or being somewhere in between, somehow existing in that tension. It's producing the sound of electricity itself. So it's just having a B flat type of sound, like the main home of electricity. And it makes it feel like it's not doing its job of like moving electricity from one place to another, but it's not completely silent and dead. It's somehow alive, between being alive and being dead. And it becomes, or it is the site of a vocal performance that Jennifer wanted to.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say that the vocal performance, which involves various singers who will come eventually when we are able to do it, will come to the work, and they will enact a series of vocalizations based on a text. The text comes from Benjamin Franklin. The text itself says, in going on with these experiments, how many pretty systems do we build, which we soon find ourselves obliged to destroy? if there is no other use discovered of electricity, this, however, is something considerable, that it may help to make a vain man humble. So I think it's quite interesting that, one of the founders of electricity itself had already seen these kind of larger sense of these systems that we build, like we're talking about, and how at a certain point they kind of spin out of control, and then they end up, we getting ourselves lost in what we've created. Anyways, the performance itself, you never hear that text at all. It becomes the basis of a score, and the score, utilizes that language in order to have this musical event unfold, where the human voice merges with this object. So the human voice is connecting to the sound of this transform as a kind of tuning device. So the text becomes a timing device for the phrases that are going to be sung by the vocalists. And they go through a series of instructions. Like at the beginning, they use electrical noises or sharp and percussive sounds with lots of rest in between them in an unpredictable manner to work through each word of the text. Then they add a pitch, and they add electrical noises with their principal note and rest in between them, but not too loud. Then it builds up to a much louder sound that also involves varied electrical noises that you build again upon these texts using, for example, in the next module, using just the vowel sounds, and you sing them loudly. And then it evolves later into the secondary note, even louder, and then later in the score, the consonants only of the text, and so on and so forth. So this is the kind of like structuring device of the score, and how it uses this text as a basis to make this musical event take place in the gallery.
By the end of it, you don't know who's imitating what,
Yeah.
and everything is breaking down. I mean, that's powerful.
And there's something about, we did a prior version of this in London. Ironically, it happened on the weekend of Hurricane Maria. We were in London while this was happening, and it was quite, uncanny to have this other, moment where we were performing this blackout. Well, then a much more serious blackout then takes place in Puerto Rico, and then casts the island into darkness for some people up to a year even afterwards. If you can imagine. For those of you in Houston, what that would be like, it's kind of unthinkable. I was going to say, but there was something also really, this feeling of something sacred also was happening in this kind of event. There is this feeling, and it has this kind of mood that kind of takes you into another, again, this kind of other heightened sensorium realm that we're talking about through this action of these different individuals coming together, because the score also is done in this way that, it's built in a modular way, but it's also quite random. So there's this kind of play between structure and chance that are happening. So these things just sort of build up and build up and build up until there's a kind of, crescendo of voices and technology that come together. And it, in a way, our directive to composer David Lang was that we wanted to kind of recreate the event of a grid being overcharged, and having that kind of moment when when that happens, when you have this kind of when the moment when the transformer explodes, basically what's happening there is kind of this electrical arcing that happens. It goes zzz, and there's this big poof, and then it simmers out. So that was somehow part of the description of how we thought this performance should formally evolve.
So you might have some more relics to work with in the wake of the Uri storm. Maybe if we can also turn to the actual relic that you had described to us a bit, because it's a really fascinating connection between the work as thinking through and evoking the sense of the sacred, but the question of what we worship today, following Given Foster Wallace, is one that is deeply variable. So do we worship money and power and prestige, or are we worshiping something in a different register, we'll say, just to give a hint of where we're going next?
So this is a photograph that is of the reliquary arm of St. John the Baptist as at the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul that we had seen in person. We were, impressed by this object. It's quite, has a great power and presence. And I must mention that it's right next to the footstep of Muhammad. So the whole display is really quite, tantalizing. Anyway, we really get fascinated with these ways that these reliquaries are encased in these types of enclosures that both protect but also reveal this sacred object, which in this case would be the hand, the bones of the hand of St. John the Baptist. So this photograph, what we did though is we cropped it and we rotated it, and took the nameplate away so that it looked as if the arm is kind of lying at the side of the, as if this body that's not there is kind of like walking, you might say, with carrying a folder or something, it looks like in the photograph. And the position of the fingers are frozen in this gesture of blessing, and it appears like at rest at first glance, but it's only like on closer inspection that you see that cutout window into this golden arm that reveals the encasing of this bone relic of the saint. And this prosthetic relic at once evokes the absent flesh of the hand together with its pulsating basilic, dorsal, and cephalic veins, and reminded Guillermo and myself of this anatomical network of signals, nerves, tissues, bones, and fluids that are mobilized in the transformation of thought into gesture, right? So just even there's a kind of network or agency that happens when you just lift your hand that also, in a way, we found an analogy then by thinking about this photograph in a kind of idea of transubstantiation of as a religious technology, where one thing can actually become another. And in the context of the show at the Menil, we're thinking about this energetic technologies that are capable of transmuting physical properties of objects as they enter into these superhuman networks of transnational capital. So this was the kind of play that we were trying to set up, or this work, it was just an earlier work, kind of led us to these other pieces.
And to Blackout, the actual work, that you also have one section of the interior of the work that is cast in bronze.
Mm-hmm. So the inner coils, the actual electrical cables, those copper coils, which are the things that are actually housing that energy here exploded, have now become encased in this precious material. And then the outer case, is cut away to reveal this inner reliquary.
Beautiful. So you have the guts coming forward, the splachna. Jonathan, did you want to?
I find this so discomforting in all the right ways, I think, I hope, because a reliquary houses the remains of a saint. They house the physical trace of holiness, of something that is not like the rest of the world, that is supposed to have renounced, wealth and luxury and prestige and all those kinds of things. That's what sets saints apart. And the reliquary preserves the traces of their lives in these beautiful displays, to be sure, but they're meant to be a reminder of something not of this world. And then to see that, in fact, what we venerate is capital, is power, is the ability to exert it over others through physical mediums like electricity, that when the reliquary and the power transformer merge, it really unnerves me to think about what we find sacred and what we have held sacred when it's revealed, as this has. Yeah,
that's a beautiful sense of unnerving that I think is illustrated very directly in Cadastre, because it's not just the question then of what is it that we value. We can see it in the effects. And if you'd be willing to talk about the title of the work and what it is measuring, that is one of the symptoms, at least, that we can see of this shift in valuation.
Yes, so this work is made by using, we created an electromagnetic field that manifests, and using iron filings on this surface that is canvas, it manifests itself in a moment in time when it gets done. So, and then it gets fixed. So it somehow becomes almost like a specter, an image of a moment, of this energy that is a result of these opposite forces, of this tension between opposite forces that either attract each other or like pull away. So you have these two forces pushing and pulling and creating these forms that are not like us painting these things, but rather is this larger force that generates this image
or event.
And the subtitle of the work, it's basically all the electrical bill essentially that ties up this sort of moment, this sort of electromagnetic field moment, and it anchors and it links it to a place, a time, extraction,
cost of oil,
electricity, oil, international networks, bonds,
debt.
So the title somehow refers to this somehow specter or image that appears into this field that is generated by the electromagnetic field. It links it to these other forces that
are also at play.
in the work.
And as so many around Houston will know, the price gouging that's been happening, the ways in which electricity bills are going to be going through the roof for people who are lucky enough to have electricity. So this is a very real relic, right, in the title that is also very present throughout the work, that I think is a really important way for us to think about the material effects of these crises as having an artistic representation here, right, that allows us to think about and reflect on what is too horrible to really grapple with day to day, which is the real devastation that was wrought and continues to be wrought in so many ways.
I also can add that in all the works, there is like these multiple, layers of meaning that we're seeking after, but in all of them we're always returning to our theme again of midday. And in this too, I would say that there is another manifestation of this midday tension in the work itself, in the way in which these magnetic poles are holding the image is like that moment of tension, right? When the things finally are just at that fixed moment where things cannot break one way or the other. They're just, that's the limit of, that push and pull. There's no more action. Things have reached a stasis. And what you see is that moment when when you're making the work, the filings start bouncing all across the surface of the canvas until finally they reach a moment of stasis and they don't pull any further because it's reached that point of, unbreakable boundedness between these opposing forces, which again is this metaphor of noon that we find so fascinating, this sort of binary, this kind of collapsing together, this edge between two opposites that are always, sutured by this unbreakable bound that they share. And this work is a way of representing that.
Beautiful. Maybe we can move to the next room so that people can get a sense of the two-faced nature of the exhibition. One seemingly light, the other seemingly dark, and yet the dialectics are really moving in both spaces because it's the whole of the exhibition that induces that sense of awe, that invokes the spectrality of the noonday demon. And we see in this next room, the centerpiece here is, if you'd like to describe the work of Entelechy and the materials as well as the origin story behind it, that would be a wonderful way of setting up how we can think through the relationship with the first room.
But in this work, in other works, like for example, in Blackout, that there was the splitting of the transformer, or in Cadastre, you see these sort of poles just pushing, until they reach the stasis, or even in Manifest, which is the two-phase object. So there's another moment of splitting and cutting, and transformation. Again, the engines are now made out of guano, or bird and bat guano. And
We'll go back to that later, though.
Yeah, but the point is that which is a form of energy. So the engines themselves are not anymore a machine producing energy. And what they do now, instead of producing sound, is absorbing sound. So there's this sort of, transformation. And in this case, different than these other ones that they're splitting, the tree was split by lightning, which is a force that is not man-made, but it's another force that created splitting on this object. This is the object that we found and cast, that is based on a tree of the same species that also fell in a forest in the 1940s, and the roots opened an aperture that led to the discovery of Lascaux, of prehistory. So in this world, you have this sort of temporality between prehistoric times and the here and now, right? You have these two things, two forces, and also you have coal itself.
The material that the work is made out of, which is another kind of history or another deeper sense of time, and there's another one of these kind of binaries between this buried sunlight that is what coal effectively is from millions of years ago, and this latent possibility of energy, again, that's held in it, and how it is then shaped into this object, which is this tree. Those, again, are another, again, one of these other moments of creating these, again, binary or extreme modes that are absolutely attached to each other and inseparable from each other, I would say. So there's this notion here of, the deep time of geology that, that makes extraction possible, right? There has to be this other kind of a past that is, that we're trying to break apart and break open to make energy with, right? We have to dig into the earth and pull out these resources to break it open to then, use it, and then it's wasted, and then it's just expended, and then it's gone. And so there's this kind of these kind of practices that are part of our contemporary way of making energy. We're somehow wanting to bring to light or bring to head in this object that's in the gallery.
Also, if you go to the image before, you could see that in the installation itself, we made an opening on the skylight of the exhibition space. So you have an oculus, basically. That at noon, light comes in and illuminates the space. So there's another way of feeling, midday in terms of light illuminating the space.
And also to creating something of sort of cave-like environment of the Lascaux, kind of evoking that idea of the cave in a certain sense. And I should also mention that, this idea of this discovery when it happened of this cave, was surrounded by these new feelings, or not feelings, but new descriptions of this kind of discovery of a prehistory, of a period before human history, and then a kind of beginning of humanity as such, right? All these kind of ideas kind of were born in the discovery of these kinds of things from the past that were, for the first time discovered. And this was also happening, again, interestingly, at the same time of the Second World War, when there was this also looming feeling of a kind of end of humanity, that, and ends of life, which I don't think is too distant from how I think we're feeling again today with the ecological crisis that we're feeling. So this material, again, made of coal, which is certainly at the center of this feeling of a world gone amok with our, technological and economic systems that have, gone wild, and that is bringing about these kinds of crises that are very real and we have to now confront, and that feeling that comes with that overwhelming sense of imminent loss, I guess, that brings about of an anxiety that brings. Maybe Jonathan, you want to speak about that? I'm sure that you have much to say.
I think I'm not sure I'd add much to what you just said. That puts it very well for me, except to say that it's not as though we move from hope to despair, but it's as though we despair because of the same technologies and systems that we've created out of hope that through these we'll be saved. If we can just find solutions through better technology, through advancement, will save everything. But it doesn't work like that. Those same means of salvation become the means of destruction. And so seeing that tension of hope and despair all at once, kind of like the two poles in Cadastra, or the senses of a birth of human civilization and its imminent demise in Entelechy, is something that I feel very strongly. Absolutely.
And this piece too, I should mention, also is really part of a sculpture performance work, where you're seeing right now the sculptural work, and we have made a sound installation iteration of it for the present. But the work, you can imagine, when in the future, hopefully this summer before the exhibition closes, it'll have 5 performers who will be sitting on the tree. So there'll be these 5 singers who will sort of activate in another way this site of potentiality that's there through their voices again, and they're singing this again, another score that we worked on in collaboration with David Lang, where we took the idea of mid, again, this mid term, as a kind of structuring device for the score. So they're singing these different conjunctions of the word mid with other composites of words that mid has been attached to. And the other thing that is in the room that you hear when you're there, for example, now, is the sound. There's a sound from another work that's on the back wall called Penumbra, and there's a sound there of a kind of chirping sound. It sounds like birds, and this is a sound of violins that it's 2 tones, it's 2 notes from 2 different violins playing at the same time that create the illusion of a third sound, of a third pitch. So it's not, you're not hearing, you're hearing basically like kind of a shadow sound or an illusory sound, And that's sort of this chirping sound, which also I didn't describe it right. In Entelechy as well, there is also the sound of bird sound in that piece as well, because one of the only moments in Lascaux where you see a human figure, it's actually appears with a bird, and so there's this kind of relationship between this bird and human.
Half bird, half human. The depiction of this figure.
So in the musical performance, which we don't have present, image here, but our visuals for, you have to imagine is that they're making also this sort of canary-like sound. So they're kind of having this canary in the coal mine moment too, where they're sort of chirping and singing with this object. So
we go back to the Max Ernst hybrids between the human and the bird form. This is really striking for people who have gone to the exhibition, because when you move into this room, it sounds so much more friendly and light and like it's going to be bucolic because of the chirping, and you think that you're about to enter into this very organic ecosphere. But of course, it's the felled tree that contains this passageway into prehistory. So 2 of the central concepts that we've seen play throughout the conversation and certainly throughout the exhibition is the sense of time, how we're able to reflect on time and temporality, not just in terms of noonday as the center of the monastic day, let's say, but also in terms of the human time frame of the Anthropocene. And you're both allowing us to think through both the conditions for the Anthropocene and also forcing us to reckon with what comes next. What comes next if we are going to continue to engage in these extractive strategies that, at their own peril, as Jonathan was saying, will exhaust themselves. So we have on the one hand this sense of temporality that we get to confront in the exhibition, and on the other hand, we have this sense of work, of energy, right, of the back guano as a fertilizer, of the carbon, this transmutation, the transubstantiation that has been discussed in relation to blackout, also so present here, where you see the way in which human labor is a part of the ecosystem that you are allowing us to participate in, and how by engaging the broader sensorium, we're able to reflect on these awesome realities that might be too big, too awesome, too striking, too paralyzing, too divine, too sacred, too real to face on the day-to-day basis. So it's an invitation then to think about not only where we as individuals have been and the conditions that have given rise to this last year, but also the conditions for the rise of humanity and its movements towards progress through innovations in technology and capitalism, as well as its own encoding in late stage capitalism of its own demise. So these are really important questions that I think the exhibition makes us encounter, and that I think the conversation here is allowing us to see. And those three questions are, what is the exhibition about, which we have been describing through the Specters of Noon? The second question is, what does the exhibition allow us to see about our current condition? How does it allow us to reflect on our individual experiences of Acedia, as well as reflect on the broader infrastructural conditions that are now in a time of crisis so visible to us? And then that third question that Jonathan was bringing us back to, which is, what do we do from here, right? And what may we hope? In what way can we actually use this reckoning as a time for reflection on our individual practices as well as our communal, in order to think through how the artists as prophets allow us to think differently. And when you're in the space as well, allow us to feel differently through the reverberations of the not dead yet not living blackout, through the reverberations of energy in entelechy. So I am just delighted to be able to tie all these things together for the audience, because you'll be able to then go see the show, which will be closing down on June 20th, which will be a nice summertime end. But before we wrap up, I would love to be able to engage in some of the audience questions. If Jennifer, Guillermo, Jonathan, you're up for it?
Sure. And maybe one more thought to kind of lead into the audience questions, because maybe it kind of relates to their questions, is I don't know if we made clear another very important theme that that certainly informed the whole thinking of this exhibition, and that is, this encounter with surrealism, specifically in the Caribbean. So when we went back to that Kawa text, and then we thought about 1930s, early 40s, and then we came to this historical event where there was the surrealists who ended up in the Caribbean, and that encounter between them, who are going through this kind of own spiritual crisis in the Europe on the verge of war, and then encountering these anti-colonial poets and thinkers in the island of Martinique, which one of our works references. And I think your question about where do we go from here, I think there might be a clue to that in that encounter with Breton and the surrealists and the others, Lévi-Strauss and the others who were escaping the Second World War, and their encounter with Aimé Césaire and Suzanne Césaire and the René Menil and those who were around this literary journal Tropiques, which was foremost an anti-colonial project that really said, like, when there's no time to have stasis, we have work to do, and this work is a work of absolute resistance to things that are, these other larger forces that are keeping, in that case, the colonial subject in this other kind of stasis that seemed immobile at that time.
So I will bring in the fourth question, because I think that is what we're already discussing, which is the unnamed participant says that they're curious about your thoughts for a remedy of this noontime demon that is vastly existent throughout our culture and climate. So if we could get the representative views of both the scholar of antiquity as well as the artists of modernity. Jonathan, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So I don't know how relevant this will seem, but maybe when you read the monks on what to do about Acedia, the answer isn't prayer, because that's actually too tough. The answer is usually physical labor, something simple, something, this is where people baking sourdough while stuck at home is actually a solution in some ways to that experience, because you have to think small. Part of the problem of being overwhelmed by Acedia is thinking too big, is getting to the point where you can start thinking big and then finding that it's so much. And the sense of, these vast systems and forces of things like colonialism and capitalism are so big that it's hard to imagine how resistance is possible unless you start to think about it in terms of small actions, small things that really are open to individuals or at small group level. So it's a general thought, but kind of thinking small and thinking simply rather than trying to tackle the whole thing might be one bit of advice that the early monks would have.
Guillermo, Jennifer?
The work. I mean, I remember reading the Reliquaries, and that was or talking back. So just through some kind of practice of talking back to the demons, that is very important, right?
Yeah,
and
well, I like that. Yeah, that's right. Learning to have a response ready when these senses kind of rise up to overwhelm you, to have something ready in response, whether that's a word or an action, a practice, that can lead to greater, building up abilities to resist and to even kind of work through that personal experience of Acedia and maybe open up a way of beginning to deal with the more spectral and vast kind of systemic problems that give rise to it.
Yeah, I think we also have the dialectic between the individual coping with Acedia, which is very much work, daily practices. How do we shape our lives when we can't count on our thoughts and will to sustain us? And that's why the work of the body, which is also very present in some of your other works, Track and Field, Body and Flight, and the way in which the human body is always engaged in this form of production, of labor, of energizing, that is not in itself being exploited or instrumentalized, but is instead a transformative practice. And then how do we enable ourselves to reshape our lives in ways that are accountable to and critical of the very conditions that preclude flourishing for all? How do we see these moments of crisis as a trial and judgment, where we can start to name and see the infrastructural problems? We in energy capital of America are able to see and name what these issues are, not in order to, as the artist put it yesterday, point fingers. It's not about blame. It's about what do we do? And this sense of an orientation towards collective action, this sense that we can shape ourselves, and we can only shape ourselves in a meaningful way if we're also contributing to meaningful social change. This is where I think that dialectic between the transformation of self and the transformation of society is so at the heart of what Cashin and these monks are doing in terms of establishing new ways of life in a time of a crumbling empire, in a time of ecological disaster, in a time when the economic and the political and social conditions of life are undergoing change. And the question is, do we have the ability to have insight? Do we have the courage to name these issues? How do we even get there, if not through these encounters with difference, with these encounters with these works in Specters of Noon, which challenge us to see where we've always been and to potentially open up new sites for thinking and therefore resisting. So I would say, what is the practice? Daily practices, your labor, but also go see Specters of Noon, right? Engage in the critical practice of what it is to see things and say things, to put it really stupidly. So that's a lovely ending question. If we can do one more question that I think brings us into the same domain, which is from David Waters, who asks, if Acedia is presented as an individual sin of the soul in early times, how can it be understood as also constructed by social conditions, identities, oppressive structures, perhaps as resistance to such? Can I?
Jonathan.
Sure. I mean, so this is one of those things where, yes, it affects the individual because we all experience things ourselves. And so that's how the monks would write the kind of phenomenology of Acedia. But they say, and you might have heard it at the beginning when Niki was reading, it affects solitaries especially. And you might think, well, why solitaries? And that's because the monks aren't thinking that it's just a sin of the soul, like, oh, I screwed up. But it's a natural, maybe an inevitable kind of emotional and bodily response to conditions. And for the monks, these are chosen conditions: deliberate isolation, a deliberately very sparse schedule, deliberate practices. But those same kinds of conditions can also be imposed without being so willing. And so this is why I tend to think that Acedia is kind of the emotion of the pandemic in so many ways, because those same sorts of social conditions actually produce this experience. And so is important also to note that for the monks, they didn't just call it a sin. In fact, most of the time they didn't call it a sin. They call it a thought or a passion. And a passion is more like a strong emotion, even if it's one that kind of manifests as an absence of emotion. But it's a thought, a train of thought, a way of thinking, and it's a demon, something that comes from the outside that you're not responsible for. And so it's important to realize that they weren't thinking of it just as sin, but as a way of understanding the internal and external causes, including social conditions and other beings, of a certain kind of emotional complex that could be very detrimental, but could also be a call to action and a sign of progress. So I think that might be the beginning of a response to that question.
Also, it's interesting to mention how Thomas Aquinas identifies Acedia as the sorrow of the world.
That's a good way to put it.
I want to, on a different train of thought, I was thinking as we're describing this, though, I'm reminded of some other point that I don't know if it's come across in this talk, in this conversation, is this idea of agency. We're talking about agents earlier on, right? And I think when we're talking also about the subject, I'd like to kind of clarify like my own understanding or the kind of thought of subjectivity itself or of personhood. I think, at least in our practice, in our viewpoint, is more of one that is very entangled, very a constellation of forces. So I think in a larger kind of mode of contemporary thought, there is a recognition finally of the idea that the subject is something that is part of a network or a constellation of many things. It's not this thing that's separate from the world, but is rather a kind of intersection of many different things that are both human and non-human and otherwise. And so when we talk about our way of presenting ourselves in front of this condition of acedia, I think we have to first also deconstruct and decenter what is the we or the I to begin with as something itself that is not a fixed entity.
That brings us beautifully back to the beginning of Jonathan's talk on American exceptionalism and the mythos of autonomy, which is only a conceit. And it's to our own detriment that we think that the power good can be isolated from the coast. It's to our detriment that we think that we can do it ourselves, because whether we like it or not, we are embedded within these conditions. We are shaped by so many factors beyond our control. And the question is really not, what can't we do, but it's what can we do? And how do we do it with deliberateness and care for each other in a way that humanizes instead of objectivizes on the basis of what we can see from the past, diagnose in the present, and start to plan for better in the future. So I want to thank the amazing artists, Jennifer and Guillermo. Your Specters of Noon have given us so much to experience and feel, as well as think through. And Jonathan, your beautiful description of the worldview and these ancient agencies, as well as where we might go from here, has proven really fascinating to me. I hope that the broader audience has been able to find some new little avenues for inquiry. We've been talking about going in the rabbit hole. So hopefully this presentation is able to open up more questions than answer them, because certainly this is going to be a collaborative effort as we're thinking through in terms of our precarious ecologies and our own individual wrestlings with academia. So thank you again. Thank you to Lauren Pollock, to Tony Martinez, to Cesar Cabrera, to Michelle White, the Menil Collection more broadly. And I would like to wish you all a good night and to invoke you to take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Niki. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you both. Yes.
Thank you. Someday I'll see you in person. Maybe back here.
Thanks.